He thought humiliating her would entertain the crowd, but he had no idea he was about to lose control of the entire room. The golden lights of the grand Riverside Auditorium spilled across rows of velvet seats, where guests in tailored suits and evening gowns whispered over programs that cost more than a week's rent, their voices blending into a low, expectant hum. On that stage, beneath a $2 million chandelier, Victor Langston stood at the piano, the celebrated virtuoso whose name alone could fill a 2,000-seat hall in under an hour. His smile was polished, practiced, but tonight, there was something sharper behind it, something restless. And just beyond the stage, unnoticed by most, Evelyn Carter moved quietly along the side aisle, her gray uniform playing against the sea of silk and black tie, a cleaning cloth tucked into her apron pocket as she made sure every surface reflected the perfection expected of a place like this. She had worked here for 3 years, always arriving after sunset, always leaving before the applause, a woman whose presence was measured only by the absence of dust she left behind. To them, she was invisible. To Victor, she was an irritation. He had seen her before, lingering too close to the stage, pausing just a second too long whenever the piano lid was open, as if memorizing something she had no right to understand. Some people forget their place, he muttered earlier that evening, his voice low but edged with contempt as he adjusted his cufflinks backstage, speaking to a group of assistants who laughed just a little too quickly. It had been a long night already, a last-minute cancellation from a guest performer leaving a gap in the program, and Victor, never one to waste an opportunity, felt the stirrings of an idea forming, something that would amuse the crowd and remind everyone exactly who commanded the stage. The performance had been flawless so far, every note precise, every pause deliberate, the audience hanging onto his control like a thread. Then, as the final chord of his piece faded into the rafters, he stood, soaking in the applause, before raising a hand for silence. The room obeyed instantly. His eyes scanned the crowd, then drifted past them, landing somewhere unexpected. A faint smirk curved his lips. "You know," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly to the back row, smooth and confident. "Music is for everyone, at least in theory." A few polite chuckles rippled through the audience. Victor stepped away from the piano bench, his gaze fixed now, unblinking. "Why don't we test that idea tonight?" The murmurs grew louder, curiosity flickering across faces as his finger lifted, pointing not at a guest, not at a student, but toward the side aisle. Heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. And there she was. Evelyn froze under the sudden weight of attention, the soft squeak of her worn sneakers against the polished floor the only sound that seemed too loud in the growing silence. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't understand. Then the usher beside her gestured awkwardly toward the stage, uncertainty written across his face. Victor's smile widened just slightly. "Come on," he called, almost warmly, though the undertone carried something colder, something deliberate. "Let's give you your moment." A ripple of laughter, sharper now, rolled through the auditorium as all eyes locked onto her. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the cloth in her hand, her knuckles paling, but her face remained still, unreadable. Step by step, she moved forward, each footfall echoing against the marble floor, the distance to the stage stretching like a test she hadn't agreed to take. The lights grew brighter as she approached, the warmth of them pressing against her skin, the air thick with expectation, with judgment. Victor stepped aside, one hand gesturing toward the piano as if offering something generous, something kind. But his eyes said otherwise. They said this was a performance before the performance, a lesson disguised as entertainment. Evelyn reached the bench and paused, the black lacquer of the piano reflecting a distorted image of her simple clothes, her quiet presence in a world that had never made space for her. Somewhere in the audience, a voice whispered just loud enough. "Does she even know how to play?" Another chuckle followed. Victor folded his arms, watching, waiting, certain of what would come next. And for a brief second, it seemed like the entire room leaned forward together, holding its breath, ready to witness a mistake. But what none of them realized, not Victor, not the audience, not even the man adjusting his $800 watch in the front row, was that the moment her fingers would touch those keys, everything they believed about her was about to unravel. The room hadn't gone silent. yet, but it was about to. The silence did not break, it tightened. Evelyn Carter stood at the piano bench, the weight of 2,000 eyes pressing against her back, the soft glow of the stage lights turning her simple uniform into something almost out of place, like a shadow that had wandered too far into the spotlight. Up close, the piano looked even more imposing, its polished black surface reflecting the chandelier above in fractured pieces of gold and white, as if the instrument itself was watching her, waiting. Victor Langston remained just a few feet away, arms crossed, posture relaxed, but his gaze sharp, measuring, certain. He had done this before, not exactly like this, but enough to understand how a moment could be shaped, controlled, turned into spectacle. And right now, the entire room was his to command. "Go ahead," he said, his voice low enough to sound almost encouraging, yet loud enough for the front rows to hear the edge beneath it. "Do not be nervous. Just play something simple." A few people laughed softly, the kind of laughter that carried more judgment than humor. Evelyn did not respond. She lowered herself onto the bench slowly, carefully, as if the act itself required permission. Her hands rested in her lap for a moment, fingers slightly curled, the faint tremor still there, but quieter now. Less fear, and more something else, something harder to name. In the front row, a woman adjusted her shawl and leaned toward her companion, whispering, "This is uncomfortable." Her companion nodded, but did not look away. No one did. Evelyn lifted her gaze briefly, not toward Victor, not toward the crowd, but toward the keys, stretching out before her in perfect alignment, 88 notes waiting in silence. For a second, her reflection shimmered across the glossy surface, and something in her expression shifted, subtle, almost invisible, like a door closing on doubt. Victor noticed it, just a flicker, and for the briefest instant, a crease formed between his brows. Then it was gone. "Whenever you are ready," he added, stepping back another inch, giving her space, though the gesture felt more like a stage direction than kindness. The auditorium seemed to shrink around that piano, the air growing still, heavy, as if even the walls were listening. Somewhere in the upper balcony, a program slipped from someone's hand and hit the floor with a soft thud that echoed louder than it should have. No one reacted. All attention remained fixed on her. Evelyn inhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, and then she raised her hands. Not rushed, not uncertain, deliberate. Her fingers hovered just above the keys, close enough to feel the faint coolness rising from the polished ivory, but not touching yet. It was a pause that lasted only a second, maybe two, but it stretched, suspended, pulling every eye tighter into the moment. Victor tilted his head slightly, watching for the hesitation, the mistake, the inevitable confirmation of what he already believed. In his mind, this would end quickly, a few awkward notes, a polite interruption, laughter to smooth over the discomfort, and then he would reclaim the stage, the narrative, the control. That was how it always worked. That was how it was supposed to work. But something about the stillness felt different now. It was no longer the restless anticipation of a crowd expecting failure. It was quieter than that. Sharper. As if the room itself sensed a shift before anyone could name it. Evelyn's shoulders relaxed just a fraction, the tension leaving her frame not in defeat, but in focus. Her head inclined slightly, her eyes no longer searching, no longer uncertain, but fixed with a calm that did not belong to someone about to embarrass herself. Victor's smile faded, not completely, but enough to lose its ease. He opened his mouth, perhaps to add another remark, to keep the upper hand, but the words did not come. Because in that exact moment, just before sound would return to the room, just before expectation would meet reality, something unspoken settled over the audience. The kind of silence that does not come from waiting for failure, but from standing on the edge of something no one saw coming. And then, finally, her fingers began to lower. The first note landed, soft but impossibly clear, like a single drop of water echoing through a canyon. And in that instant, something shifted that no one could quite explain. It was not hesitant. It was not searching. It was placed with intention, with control, with a precision that did not belong to a mistake. A second note followed, then a third, forming a phrase that felt deliberate, almost familiar, yet carried a weight far beyond something simple. Conversations that had been waiting to resume did not. They stopped before they could begin. Victor Langston's posture stiffened, just slightly, his arms no longer resting as comfortably across his chest as before, his eyes narrowing as he watched her hands move with a steadiness that did not match the narrative he had created. Evelyn did not look at the audience. She did not look at Victor. Her gaze remained on the keys, but her expression had changed completely now, the uncertainty gone, replaced by something quiet and unshakable. Her fingers moved again, this time faster, connecting notes into a flowing line that carried across the auditorium with surprising strength, filling the high ceilings and wrapping around the edges of the room like something alive. In the front row, the man with the expensive watch leaned forward without realizing it, his earlier amusement fading into something closer to confusion. This was not what he expected. This was not what anyone expected. The melody expanded, growing more intricate, more demanding, each transition executed with a control that suggested not just familiarity, but mastery. A woman in the balcony lowered her program slowly, her eyes fixed now, no longer watching out of curiosity, but out of something deeper, something that pulled her into the sound. Victor took a step closer to the piano, almost unconsciously, as if proximity might help him understand what was unfolding in front of him. His jaw tightened. This was not part of the performance. This was not part of the plan. Evelyn's hands moved with increasing confidence, her left hand anchoring the rhythm with quiet authority while her right hand traced a line of notes, so fluid it seemed effortless, each phrase building on the last, rising and falling with emotional clarity that could not be faked. It was not just technical skill. It was memory. It was history, the kind that lived in the body, not just the mind. Somewhere in the middle rows, a quiet gasp slipped out before it could be contained, quickly followed by silence again, deeper this time, heavier, as if the audience had collectively realized they were no longer watching a spectacle, but witnessing something real. Victor's smile was gone now, completely. In its place was something else, something closer to disbelief, his confidence cracking not in a dramatic way, but in small, undeniable fractures that spread with every passing second. He glanced briefly toward the wings, as if expecting someone to intervene, to explain, to restore the order he understood. No one moved. No one spoke, because the music did not allow it. Evelyn leaned slightly into the next phrase, her shoulders relaxed, her movements precise, her presence filling the stage in a way that no introduction ever could have. The chandelier above seemed to glow softer now, the light settling into the moment rather than overpowering it, as if even the room itself had adjusted to her rhythm. The piece grew more complex, layering emotion over technique, speed over stillness, tension over release, each transition executed without hesitation, without doubt. And then, somewhere between one breath and the next, the realization began to settle across the audience, not all at once, but in waves, moving from row to row, from glance to glance. This was not a coincidence. This was not luck. This was not a joke that had gone slightly off script. This was something far more unsettling for the man who had orchestrated it. Because the person he had pulled onto that stage, the one he had reduced to a moment of entertainment, was no longer invisible. And as her hands continued to move, faster now, stronger, commanding the full range of the instrument with effortless authority, one truth began to press itself into the silence that surrounded them all. He had not brought her up there to expose her weakness. He had brought her up there at the exact moment she was ready to reveal who she had always been. The music did not slow. It deepened, unfolding into something far beyond a demonstration of skill, something layered with intention and memory that no one in that room could ignore any longer. Evelyn's hands moved across the keys with absolute control, every note placed exactly where it belonged, not rushed, not forced, but inevitable, as if the piano had been waiting for her specifically, not for the polished performer who had commanded it minutes earlier. The melody shifted again, transitioning into a passage so technically demanding that even those with only a passing understanding of music felt the change, the difficulty rising like a quiet challenge that demanded attention. In the front rows, expressions transformed, amusement replaced by concentration, by disbelief, by something closer to respect that no one had intended to give her. Victor Langston stood just behind her now, no longer at ease, his posture rigid, his hands slowly uncurling at his sides as if he needed to steady himself against something he could not yet define. He knew this piece, not in fragments, not casually. He knew it completely. It was one of the most difficult compositions in his own repertoire, something he performed only at select events, something that required years of discipline to execute with precision. And yet, she was not struggling. She was not approximating. She was playing it as if it belonged to her. A faint crease formed across his forehead, deeper now, his mind racing through explanations that refused to settle into anything believable. This was not coincidence. This was not imitation. This was mastery that had been hidden in plain sight. Evelyn leaned slightly forward as the tempo increased, her fingers accelerating with effortless clarity, each movement economical, refined, free of hesitation. The sound filled every inch of the auditorium, rising into the balconies, pressing gently against the walls, commanding attention without ever demanding it. A man in the middle section removed his glasses slowly, blinking as if clarity might change what he was hearing. It did not. A woman beside him placed her hand over her mouth, not in shock, but in quiet recognition of something rare, something undeniable. The performance was no longer surprising. It was undeniable. Victor took another step closer, close enough now to see the subtle details, the way her wrists remained relaxed, the way her fingers curved naturally, the way her posture aligned perfectly with the instrument, as if she had spent years, not moments, at this bench. His breathing shifted, shallow, controlled, but no longer steady. This was not how control was supposed to feel. The audience remained completely still, not out of politeness, but because movement itself felt intrusive, like speaking during a moment that demanded silence. The earlier whispers, the laughter, the quiet judgments had all disappeared, replaced by a stillness so complete it felt deliberate, as if the entire room had chosen to listen in a way it had not planned to. Evelyn's expression remained calm, focused, untouched by the weight of the moment, as if none of this was new to her, as if she had stepped into something familiar rather than extraordinary. The music swelled again, reaching a peak that required both strength and restraint, her hands crossing, separating, returning with flawless timing, the complexity unfolding without effort. Victor's reflection flickered across the piano's surface, distorted, fractured by the movement, his presence no longer central, no longer commanding. He was no longer the one controlling the narrative. He was watching it change without permission. And then, as the final section approached, the tension in the room shifted once more, not into uncertainty, but into anticipation, the kind that comes when something powerful is about to resolve. Every person in that auditorium felt it, even if they could not explain why. Because this was no longer about proving anyone wrong. It was about revealing something that had never needed their approval to exist. And as Evelyn's fingers prepared to carry the piece into its final movement, one realization settled heavily over Victor Langston, quiet but undeniable. He had not just misjudged her. He had built an entire moment around the assumption that she had nothing to reveal. And now, standing just a few feet away, he was watching that assumption collapse note by note, with no way to stop it, no way to reclaim what he had already given away. The final movement did not arrive gently. It surged forward with a quiet authority that filled the entire auditorium, as if every note had been building toward this exact moment, every phrase leading to something inevitable. Evelyn's hands moved faster now, but not with urgency, with certainty, each motion precise, controlled, effortless in a way that made the complexity almost invisible. The music expanded, rich and layered, pulling the audience deeper into something they could no longer resist, something that demanded not just attention, but respect. In the front row, the man with the expensive watch no longer leaned forward out of curiosity. He sat completely still, his eyes fixed, his earlier confidence replaced by a silence that mirrored the rest of the room. No one shifted in their seat. No one whispered. The space that had once been filled with quiet judgment was now filled with something else entirely, something heavier, something earned. Victor Langston did not move. He stood frozen just behind her, close enough to hear the subtle mechanics of her playing, the soft contact of fingers against keys, the controlled breathing that guided each phrase. His expression had changed completely, the sharp confidence gone, replaced by a stillness that bordered on disbelief. He knew, with a clarity that settled deep in his chest, that this was no longer a moment he could interrupt, no longer something he could frame or redirect. This belonged entirely to her. Evelyn leaned into the final sequence, her shoulders relaxed, her posture steady, her presence filling the stage in a way that did not demand attention, but commanded it without effort. The music climbed, reaching a height that required both precision and emotion, her hands crossing, separating, returning with flawless timing, each note landing exactly where it needed to be, not a fraction too early, not a fraction too late. It was not just a performance. It was a statement, delivered without words, without explanation, without apology. In the upper balcony, a woman who had laughed earlier now sat with her hand pressed lightly against her chest, her expression softened, her eyes reflecting something close to understanding. The shift had completed itself. There was no trace of mockery left in the room. Only silence, deep and complete, holding every person in place. Victor's reflection flickered again across the piano's surface, but this time it seemed smaller, less defined, as if the light itself no longer favored him. He opened his mouth slightly, perhaps to speak, perhaps to reclaim something of what he had lost, but the sound never came. Because the music would not allow it. Evelyn's fingers moved through the final measures with unwavering control, the tension resolving into something clear, something final, something undeniable. And then, with one last sequence, perfectly measured, perfectly placed, she reached the final note. It rang out into the auditorium, pure and steady, echoing against the high ceilings before slowly fading into silence. Not a single person moved. Not immediately. The room did not erupt into applause. It did not break into noise. It held still, as if everyone needed a moment to catch up to what they had just witnessed. Victor stood there, his eyes fixed on her, the realization settling fully now, heavy and inescapable. This had never been his stage to control. Not tonight. Not this moment. Evelyn did not turn to face the audience right away. She remained seated for a brief second, her hands resting lightly above the keys, her expression calm, unchanged, as if the performance had not altered her at all, only revealed her. Then slowly, she lowered her hands into her lap and stood. She did not bow. She did not look for approval. She simply stepped back from the bench, her gaze steady, her presence quiet but unshakable. And in that silence, before a single clap could begin, before anyone could decide how to respond, one truth settled across the entire room with absolute clarity. The woman they had invited onto that stage as a joke had just redefined it. And the man who had tried to control the moment no longer had a place in it. The silence did not last forever, but when it broke, it did not shatter, it unfolded slowly, like something fragile being handled with care. One pair of hands came together, a single clap echoing from somewhere near the center of the room, hesitant at first, almost uncertain, as if asking permission. Then another followed, and another, until the sound began to build, not into chaos, but into something measured, something earned. Within seconds, the entire auditorium rose into a standing ovation, the applause filling the space with a force that no one had planned, no one had rehearsed. It was not polite. It was not automatic. It was real. Evelyn Carter stood still at the edge of the piano bench, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if the reaction, as overwhelming as it was, did not surprise her. She did not bow deeply or gesture dramatically. She simply acknowledged the moment with a quiet nod, her eyes steady, her presence grounded in something that did not depend on approval. Victor Langston did not clap. Not at first. He stood there, surrounded by the sound, yet separate from it, his hands at his sides, his mind struggling to catch up to what had just unfolded in front of him. This was not a miscalculation. It was a complete reversal. The narrative he had constructed, the control he had assumed, the authority he had relied on, all of it had shifted in a matter of minutes, without warning, without permission. Around him, the audience continued, their applause growing stronger, some faces lit with admiration, others with a quiet sense of realization, as if they were not only responding to the performance, but to the moment itself, to the truth it had revealed. Victor finally brought his hands together, but the motion was delayed, restrained, lacking the confidence that had defined him earlier that evening. His eyes remained fixed on Evelyn, searching, questioning, trying to understand how someone he had dismissed so completely could stand so firmly in a space he believed belonged only to him. Evelyn stepped back from the piano fully now, her movements unhurried, her attention no longer on the instrument, but not yet on the crowd either. For a brief moment, her gaze shifted slightly, not toward the front rows, not toward the balcony, but toward the side of the stage, the place where she had stood just minutes ago, invisible, unnoticed, unacknowledged. It was a small glance, almost imperceptible, but it carried something deeper, something reflective, as if she were measuring the distance between who they thought she was and who she had always been. The applause continued, filling the space, but beneath it, a different kind of silence still lingered, quieter, more internal, settling into the minds of those who had watched the entire transformation unfold. Victor took a step forward, his polished shoes echoing faintly against the stage, and for a moment it seemed as though he might speak, might attempt to reclaim some portion of the moment, to reframe it, to place himself back at the center. But when he opened his mouth, no words came, because there was nothing he could say that would restore what had been lost. Evelyn turned slightly now, her body angled toward him, her expression unchanged, calm, composed, but her eyes held something new, not defiance, not pride, but clarity. She did not need to confront him. She did not need to explain anything. The truth had already been delivered, note by note, in a language that required no translation. The applause began to soften, not because it had lost its energy, but because it had reached its natural end, the audience slowly returning to their seats, though their attention remained fixed, their expressions still marked by what they had just experienced. Victor stood there, no longer the center of attention, no longer the authority the room had followed without question. And in that quiet transition, one realization settled over him with undeniable weight. This had never been about giving her a moment. It had been about taking one away. And he had failed. Completely. Evelyn did not wait for further acknowledgement. She simply stepped away from the piano, her movements as quiet as when she had first entered the room, but now every step carried a different meaning, one that no one in that auditorium could ignore. And as she began to walk back toward the shadows at the side of the stage, the same place where she had once been invisible, the room did not look away this time. Because they understood now. They were not watching a woman return to the background. They were watching someone choose it. The sound of her footsteps against the stage floor was softer than the applause had been, but somehow it carried farther, drawing every eye as Evelyn Carter moved toward the edge of the spotlight she had never asked to stand in. The golden light followed her for a moment, then began to fade as she stepped closer to the side of the stage, where shadows waited quietly, familiar and undemanding. Yet this time, the shadows did not hide her. They framed her. The audience did not return to conversation. They did not check their phones or glance at their watches. They watched her leave with the same attention they had given her performance, as if the silence she carried now was just as powerful as the music she had left behind. Victor Langston remained where he was, standing near the piano, the instrument that had defined his identity for years now feeling strangely distant, as though it no longer belonged entirely to him. His gaze followed her, not with the confidence of a man observing someone beneath him, but with the unsettled focus of someone trying to understand a reality that had shifted beyond his control. For the first time that evening, he looked uncertain, not outwardly, not in a way that would be obvious to a casual observer, but in the subtle tightening of his posture, in the slight hesitation before he moved. He turned back toward the audience, as if remembering where he was, as if trying to step back into the role that had always come so naturally to him. The room, however, did not respond the same way it had before. The applause had faded, but the energy remained, redirected, no longer centered on him. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, where the audience seemed to wait, not for him, but for something else, something unspoken. Victor cleared his throat lightly, the sound small in comparison to the presence that still lingered in the room. "Thank you," he began. His voice smooth, controlled, but lacking the effortless authority it had carried earlier. That was unexpected. A few polite nods appeared in the crowd, but no one laughed, no one filled the space for him. The moment did not belong to him anymore, and everyone seemed to understand it without needing it explained. He forced a faint smile, stepping forward, reclaiming the center of the stage physically, even if something less tangible had already slipped away. Music has a way of surprising us, he continued, attempting to guide the narrative back into familiar territory, to place himself once again as the interpreter of the moment. But even as he spoke, his eyes flickered briefly toward the side of the stage where Evelyn had disappeared, as if part of his attention refused to leave her entirely. Behind the curtain, just out of sight, Evelyn slowed her steps. The noise of the auditorium softened into a distant echo, replaced by the quiet hum of backstage, the muted glow of utility lights, the familiar scent of polished wood and fabric. She paused for a moment, her hand resting lightly against the wall, her breathing steady, unchanged. There was no rush of triumph, no visible reaction to what had just happened. Only a quiet stillness, the same one she had carried with her onto the stage, now settling back into place. A stagehand nearby glanced at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and something close to awe, as if he had just witnessed something he did not fully understand. "I did not know you could play like that," he said softly, almost as if speaking too loudly might disturb something important. Evelyn looked at him briefly, her expression calm, her eyes clear. "Most people did not," she replied, her voice even, without bitterness, without pride, just a simple statement of truth. On the other side of the curtain, Victor's voice continued, filling the space, attempting to restore rhythm, to guide the audience forward, but something had changed in the way they listened. They were no longer absorbing his words with the same unquestioned attention. There was a shift, subtle but undeniable, in the balance of presence, in the weight of perception. Evelyn lowered her hand from the wall and reached into her apron pocket, pulling out the small cleaning cloth she had been holding earlier, the same one that had been there when she was invisible, when she was overlooked, when she was underestimated. She held it for a moment, then folded it neatly, her movements precise, controlled, as if nothing about her had changed at all. And yet everything had. She glanced once more toward the stage, not with longing, not with regret, but with quiet understanding. She did not need to stand there again to prove anything. The moment had already spoken, and as she turned to continue down the narrow backstage hallway, her footsteps steady, her presence returning to the quiet rhythm she had always known, one truth lingered in the air she left behind, not spoken, not announced, but felt by everyone who had been in that room. Some people do not step into the spotlight to be seen. They step into it to remind the world what it failed to notice. Back on stage, the rhythm of the evening never fully recovered, no matter how carefully Victor Langston tried to guide it forward. His next piece began exactly as planned, his fingers moving with practiced precision across the keys, each note technically flawless, each transition executed with the same discipline that had built his reputation. And yet, something was missing. It was not a mistake anyone could point to. It was not an error in timing or tone. It was something quieter, something deeper, something the audience could feel but not explain. The room listened, but not the same way. Their attention, once unquestioned, now carried a comparison that had not existed before. Every phrase he played seemed to echo against the memory of what they had just witnessed, and that memory refused to fade. In the front row, the man with the expensive watch folded his hands together, his gaze steady but no longer impressed in the same way. A woman in the balcony leaned back slightly, her expression thoughtful rather than captivated. The applause that followed each segment came, but it was measured, polite, lacking the spontaneous energy that had filled the room earlier. Victor felt it, not as a single moment, but as a gradual realization, settling in with each passing minute. He pressed forward, maintaining composure, adjusting his dynamics, refining his tempo, doing everything that had always worked before. But control, once so natural, now felt forced, as if he were performing not just for the audience, but against something unseen. Behind the curtain, Evelyn Carter continued down the narrow hallway, the distant sound of the performance following her like a fading echo. She passed storage rooms, coiled cables, and neatly stacked equipment cases, each familiar detail grounding her in a world that had always been simple, always been steady. A few staff members glanced up as she walked by, their expressions different now, more attentive, more aware. One of them, a lighting technician who had worked in the theater for over a decade, watched her carefully before speaking. "You should not be back here," he said, not unkindly, but with a quiet sense of disbelief. Evelyn paused, turning slightly toward him, her expression calm. "This is where I work," she replied, her voice even, as if nothing about that fact had changed. The technician hesitated, then nodded slowly, as if realizing that the truth of her position had not been erased by what he had seen, but expanded by it. On stage, Victor finished another piece, the final note landing cleanly, precisely, but the response that followed was respectful rather than overwhelming. He stood, acknowledging the applause with a slight bow, his movements controlled, but his eyes carried something unsettled, something searching. As he straightened, his gaze drifted once more toward the side of the stage, toward the place where she had disappeared. For a brief second, the thought crossed his mind, uninvited but undeniable, that the most powerful moment of the evening had not belonged to him at all. The realization did not come with anger. It came with something quieter, something more difficult to ignore. A shift. Backstage, Evelyn reached a small utility sink, setting her cloth down and running water over it. The simple motion steady, familiar, grounding. The sound of the running water blended with the distant music, creating a quiet contrast between two worlds that had briefly intersected and then separated again. She wrung the cloth carefully, her hands moving with the same precision they had shown on the piano, though no one was watching now. No one was applauding. And yet, there was no difference in her demeanor. No need for recognition. One of the younger staff members approached slowly, hesitant, as if unsure whether he should speak. "That was incredible," he said finally, his voice sincere, lacking any of the earlier judgment that had filled the auditorium. Evelyn glanced at him, her expression softening just slightly. "Thank you," she replied, simple and direct. No elaboration. No explanation. On stage, Victor prepared for his closing piece, adjusting the bench, aligning himself with the instrument once more. The audience settled, their attention returning, but the energy remained altered, shaped by what had already happened. He placed his hands on the keys, pausing for a brief moment before beginning. And in that pause, something unspoken lingered, not just for him, but for everyone in the room. Because no matter how the night continued, no matter how it ended, one truth had already taken root, quiet but unshakable. The performance they would remember was not the one they came to see, and the person they would not forget was the one they almost ignored. The final notes of Victor Langston's closing piece faded into the high ceiling of the auditorium, precise and controlled, exactly as they were meant to be, but when the sound dissolved into silence, the response that followed confirmed what he already knew but could no longer deny. The applause came, respectful, consistent, but it did not rise, it did not surge, it did not transform the room the way it once had. It stayed where it was, contained, measured, as if the audience was honoring a performance while remembering another. Victor stood, offering a composed bow, his posture flawless, his expression steady, but behind that composure, something had shifted permanently. He straightened slowly, scanning the room, meeting the eyes of people who had admired him for years, yet now looked at him with something more complex than admiration alone. There was respect, yes, but there was also comparison, a quiet recalibration of everything they thought they understood about the stage, about talent, about presence. He stepped back from the piano, the instrument that had once felt like an extension of himself, now carrying a different weight, a shared memory that no longer belonged solely to him. The evening concluded with formal acknowledgments, polite exchanges, and the slow movement of guests rising from their seats, their conversations low, reflective, filled with a kind of energy that lingered beneath the surface. Words like remarkable and unexpected moved through the crowd, but one detail remained constant in every conversation, spoken or implied. It was not his name they repeated most. Backstage, the lights dimmed gradually as the performance ended, the hum of activity returning in a quieter, more practical rhythm. Evelyn Carter finished rinsing the last cloth, setting it neatly beside the sink before turning off the water. The sound ceased instantly, leaving a calm stillness in its place. She dried her hands slowly, methodically, as if nothing about the night required urgency. A stage manager passed by, pausing for just a second, his expression thoughtful, as if he wanted to say something more, something important, but could not quite find the words that matched what he had witnessed. He nodded instead, a small gesture, but one filled with a new kind of recognition. Evelyn returned the nod, simple, respectful, then picked up her supplies, preparing to continue the work she had always done. Out in the lobby, guests gathered beneath tall glass windows, the city lights stretching beyond them, their reflections flickering across polished floors. A few lingered near the entrance to the auditorium, glancing back as if expecting something more, something unfinished. Victor stepped into the lobby moments later, greeted by familiar faces, colleagues, patrons, admirers. They spoke to him with the same politeness, the same courtesy, but their questions carried a different focus now. Who was she? One asked, not casually, but with genuine curiosity. Victor paused, just briefly, before responding. A member of the staff, he said, his voice even, but lacking the dismissiveness it might have carried before. The answer felt incomplete, even to him, because it was. He watched as the conversation continued, as people speculated, as interest shifted, as attention moved in a direction he had not intended. And for the first time that evening, he did not try to redirect it, because he could not. Backstage, Evelyn moved down the hallway once more, her footsteps steady, her pace unhurried. She passed the stage door, the faint sound of the departing audience drifting in from outside, a distant echo of the world she had briefly stepped into and then left behind. She did not stop. She did not look back. The door remained closed. As she reached the end of the corridor, she placed her supplies in their proper place, aligning them carefully, maintaining the order that had always defined her space. Nothing about her environment had changed, and yet everything had. She removed her apron, folding it neatly, setting it aside with the same care she had given to every task that night. For a moment, she stood still, the quiet, surrounding her complete, uninterrupted. There was no applause here, no audience, no stage lights, only the steady presence of someone who had never needed any of it to know her worth. Outside, the city continued as it always did, unaware of the shift that had taken place within those walls. Inside, the memory remained, carried by every person who had witnessed it, a quiet reminder that would follow them long after the evening ended. And in that stillness, one truth settled without the need for announcement, without the need for repetition. The world often decides who is seen before it understands who is capable, and sometimes, all it takes is a single moment, a single note, to remind everyone how wrong that decision can be.